pleasure to introduce a fellow Pangbourne resident, Professor Sir Brian Hoskin, who I've written down his CV, but it's also on there. As you can see, he's a Professor of Meteorology at the University of Reading and established the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and Environment at Imperial College London, was its first director, and it's now its chair. And he's also been a member of the government's Committee on Climate Change. He's going to speak on Can We Avert Climate Catastrophe? Speaking personally, I hope we can. And at the end there'll be a chance for a few questions and so on, but if you're unable to ask a question, Brian's going to be around for the rest of the day, so you'll be able to nab him over a cup of tea or whatever, disturb him when he's for a moment's peace. So I'll hand you over to Brian.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Is that sounding all right there? Good. So yes, this was a title I was asked to speak to. Can we avert climate catastrophe? But just thinking about this summer, it's actually perhaps difficult to remember now, but the grass is still a little brown. The maximum temperature that we got, 40.3 in the UK, and that was 1.9 degrees, I think, above the previous record. And if you put that into Fahrenheit, it's 105 for those who are old enough. And that's sort of temperature that years ago we just thought might happen in the middle of some deserts, but not here. And actually, even more remarkable was the highest minimum temperature was 6.8, I think. That's 80 Fahrenheit. So in Oxfordshire, it didn't go below 80 degrees Fahrenheit during the night. And of course, there was a drought with it all, and this wasn't just us, it was across the whole of Europe. There's the Rhine, almost unnavigable, and crops generally down about 15%, staple crops. And we go to China. There's been a very severe drought in China, and of course the floods in Pakistan, which we hear about recently. And these are typical sort of things with climate change, where the heat extremes have become more extreme than any of us expected it yet. And also, we did expect that when it's dry, it becomes drier, and equally when it becomes wet, it becomes wetter. So these are the sort of things we expected, but they are happening rather sooner. But let me now, I will start by saying where we are on climate change before I get to saying what we're trying to do about it and will we succeed. So, oh, what happened there? Okay, good. That's a bad start, isn't it? Right, so just to go back to the measurement of the gas that we really are most concerned about, carbon dioxide. It's been measured in the atmosphere since 1957. These actually show measurements from Hawaii, which is where it was started, but they're almost the same around the world because it's a well-mixed gas. And there you can see from 1957, there's an annual cycle, up and down in red, we understand that, but you can see behind the average then is just rising inexorably. And you wouldn't know from that we think we've been doing something about climate change, because the curve is just rising, as it has been, in fact steeper in the last 20 years. During all the time when we've been having negotiations on climate change, then the curve has gone inexorably upwards. And we know that whenever we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, then it's going to stay there, basically. On our human timescales, it's going to stay there. And we also know that if the carbon dioxide level rises, the Earth will continue to warm. So that comes to the idea that the only way to stop this is actually for those emissions of carbon dioxide due to our activities to go to zero. And the question is on what timescale we can do that, which comes towards the latter part of my talk. But again, to just show where, I should say the numbers are, well, don't worry what the scale is, but you can see that since I gave my first talk on climate change in 1975, and it was down there. Now, some few years later, it's up there. It's gone up by, what's it, a third. And since the pre-industrial period, it's gone up by a half, basically. So we're very confident of that, and that it is due to our activities. You have to go back a very long time, 3 million years or so, in order to get to this sort of level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So there's various ways of showing what the temperature has been, and this is Ed Harrison has become famous with his stripes, which are even on the Reading Football Club strip. And these show, the colour indicates how warm it was, and that's back to 1850 at the left-hand side, and up to date on the right-hand side. I don't know whether they're going to change their strip every year as they add another one on, but I mean, it's a pretty dramatic way of showing how much warmer it's got. Now that's, as scientists, we... Oh, it is, okay, it is right. Okay, right, so to put this in context then, over here you have the last few years where it's observed measure here. We can get very good indications of what the level's been in the past. So this is over the last 2,000 years, and you can see how the temperature, sorry, this is global temperatures, and you can see how the warming now, which is about 1.2 above the past, and how that's just totally different from what's happened in the last 2,000 years. In fact, it's the warmest period in the last 100,000 years. You have to go back to 125,000 years ago, the last interglacial period, when it was a degree or so warmer, but as a warning to us, sea level was probably 5 meters higher as well. So it stayed around that warmth, and if that warmth stays around, then sea level is that much higher. Right, so I've said about all the things that are happening. Global temperature is just a measure, and what's the weather is actually far more exciting than the global average temperature suggests. But about the future, what are we looking for in temperatures? And these sorts of pictures have not changed very much in the last 30 years or so. There are some slight changes. But essentially, if we don't change our behaviour, then we are looking at a temperature rise of something about 4 degrees or so by the end of the century. So that's the direction we're going. Whereas if emissions fell rapidly to zero, certainly by the middle of the century, then you're looking at something that could stabilise at about 1.5 degrees. So it depends on us which scenario you take. There is a little bit of uncertainty around there, you can see the shading, but basically the message is there, and we're very confident in that message. Now, 4 degrees temperature rise, it's very easy to think, okay, well, we just add on today and add 4 degrees on, but it's far more exciting again than that. I've shown a couple of pictures here for what the models, a range of models give for the actual global distribution of temperature on the left-hand side. And if the temperature rises by 4 degrees, over land it means 5 degrees on average, because the ocean warms slower. And so you take the tropics, you add on 5 degrees to the temperature in Bangladesh, India, whatever, and you can just imagine the impact of that in the tropics, where the variability, the natural variability is small. This is taking them way beyond. And in areas where it's marginal, where the human activity can occur in the middle of the summer anyway. So we're looking at that. We're also, I won't get into the science, which is what I really enjoy, but you can see the temperature contrast changes. So, for instance, near us, it's very warm over southern Europe, North Africa, and much cooler over the Atlantic. That temperature contrast is what generates weather. So that it's not just warmer, the weather is different as well. Right, so, and also at high latitudes in the middle of the winter, the temperature rise expected something more like 12 degrees. So in the permafrost regions you add 12 degrees and it isn't permafrost anymore. And you can imagine what that does. Right hand side, I won't give any details, but that is the estimate how precipitation will change. The Mediterranean, for instance, becomes marginal in terms of, because of the drying there, and various other areas. Southern Africa, very difficult again. So big changes. Sea level. Sea level is important. I mentioned it before. it's already risen by about 20 centimetres, 20 to 30 centimetres, which makes the individual storms that are bringing the water inland that much more drastic in their behaviour. Sea level goes on rising come what may. It takes many centuries to equilibrate. So at the lowest level here we're looking more like something just over half a metre or so. But at the upper level we're looking at something half to 1 metre. That's the best estimate. And the top curve, the dashed one, is what's been put in these days, is to say, well, we cannot rule that out from our physical understanding of the system. So it is possible, particularly from the Antarctic ice sheet reduction, that one could reach 2 metres by the end of the century if we're on that upper scenario. And the Thames Barrier, the design of the next Thames Barrier, is actually such that it could cope with that 2 metres sea level rise. But many parts of the world and parts of the UK could not deal with 2 metres sea level rise. But just to emphasise the long-term nature of this, sea level goes on rising. So at the lowest level there we're looking at a change of half to 3 metres by 2300. At the upper level we're best estimate 2 to 7 metres, but it could be 15 metres or greater, depending on how the Antarctic ice sheet behaves. So these numbers are absolutely huge. It's not just if you're in an island in the Indian Ocean, low-lying island, but this is dramatic. It is dramatic for much of the world. And much of the population lives in the coastal regions, and you can imagine the impact of all this. Beyond that, there are, as I've mentioned, what are often called tipping points. I don't really like the word, but I'll use it. These are rapid changes where things don't just change slowly, they change quite suddenly. So the West Antarctic ice sheet is one of those that could reach a point at which it becomes destabilised. And the Atlantic, the overturning circulation in the Atlantic Ocean, or maybe the tundra, the melting of the tundra releases methane. These are things we're not sure of, but they are all sort of things that could happen and could happen quite suddenly. I always like to add that there are human tipping points. As the sea level rises, and say you're in Bangladesh, the salt comes inland and you get the inundations. And at what point do you say, we just can't live here anymore? And the temperature has risen by 5 degrees. So then the migration problems that Europe has made such a meal of in recent times would be negligible compared with whole countries on the move. India is not going to say, welcome Bangladesh. So there's going to be a huge problem there with people moving around. It's too hot to work in many tropical countries in the middle of the day, staple crops failing, repeated droughts or floods. So what we're looking at, I think, is a situation, climate change wouldn't kill us, but we would probably kill each other under the pressure of climate change, and that's the danger we're dealing with. Now, adapting to climate change, I thought I'd put one slide in around that. We are not adapting to climate change, even the amount we've had already. We go on building in floodplains. Our housing stock is just laughable in terms of its insulation, its ability to cope with the heat in the summer, the ability to cope with floods. Our cities are not designed for it. And we're in a rich country, and in the developing world there's been many catastrophes. Pakistan at the moment is appealing for help around the world. So it's a problem. Of course, what we've had to adapt to at the moment is nothing compared with what we should be adapting to for the future. And if we're on the higher scenarios, or in some countries, it's almost practically impossible to adapt to that. But there's no doubt the developing world needs our help on both reducing their emissions as they go to development, and also in adapting to the inevitable climate change that was due to our activities in the past. So the wider context of a growing world population, urbanization, changing diet going the wrong way, the Western diet becoming the one to take on board, increased demand for everything, And at the same time, I wanted to mention the biodiversity crisis, because parallel to the climate negotiations, there's also biodiversity negotiations, and COP15 for those biodiversity negotiations will be in Montreal in December. So we don't hear too much about it, but it's been going on there. And the UN has its Sustainable Development Goals, agreed perhaps in happier times in 2015. I won't go through those. I have the badge here. That's the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And climate change is one of those and is hugely involved in many of the others. So the negotiations have been going on since 1992. And so there's the Convention of the Parties, the COP. And it's not the sort of parties that have been going on in Downing Street. These are actually the countries of the world meeting. And they've been negotiating since 1992. And by Paris, at last, they'd arrived at the thing in 2015 of saying the temperature rise should be, we should aim to make it less than 2 degrees with an aspiration of 1.5 degrees. And the way the Paris Agreement went was different from what had failed before. Rather than telling countries what they should do, Paris actually said, what do you volunteer to do? So the countries of the world said, this is what we have decided we will do and we pledge to do. So that was the difference. And another good part of this was that these were going to be revised every 5 years. It slipped 1 year, but that's why Glasgow was so important, because it was the first reassessment of those nationally determined contributions. And then there's all sorts of rules and regulations for that. So in Glasgow, it's fair to say, I think Alok Sharma was keen to say, that 1.5 degrees was still possible, just. And some things went well, other things did not go well, but really, as I say, the crucial things are the countries of the world going to keep to what the words that they spoke? Some of them were sort of pledges put down, others were talking, and this is what we think we will do. And the other part of this is the financial part. Is the developed world going to give, I've said now, because it's been promised to give 100 billion a year, and that promise has been there for many years, to help developing countries cope with the climate change that's inevitable and to pursue low carbon growth. So that's the other part, which is still up in the air. Is it going to happen? And we come then, I hope, to, is it to mention? Okay, yes, so COP27 is going to be in Egypt in the 6th to 18th of November. And really, what we're going to do is see the development on all this. I should say the UK is still in charge of the process until the handover in Egypt. You wouldn't know it from our media and from our politics, but we should still be leading the world in this. Right, so at the same time, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is scientists, I've contributed to one of these, and they've been going on again since 1990. So every now and then they produce an assessment report of where we are. So and the language used to be very moderate, sort of, if everyone was confident of something, we'd actually say it and we'd make it very moderate and say, we're absolutely sure of this. The language has become a little bit more aggressive now as it becomes, we're 30 years later and we're still in the same situation. So Working Group 1, that's the scientists talking about climate change, they said unless there are immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be beyond us. Working Group 2 is those looking at the impact of climate change, and they say the scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Essentially, we're going to miss the opportunity unless we get there. Working Group 3, which deals with policies, said the evidence is clear, the time for action is now. We can halve emissions by 2030. It's now or never. Okay, so that's where we are. So these are what the emissions look like. We have the historical bit over on the left-hand side there. So this is where we are here. And if you look at the policies that we have at the moment, you end up somewhere in here, somewhere maybe 3 degrees or slightly below. But there's various things, how seriously you take what the countries have said they do. If they keep to their targets, they've said maybe somewhere around 2.5 degrees. But if you took on account everything they've all said and that they'd actually do it, then you might say, perhaps if everything worked out, 1.8. So we're in the situation where everything is to play for. We can still do it. But the question is, will we do it? Now I think I've just put in one slide. We can do it. And this is one example. This is the International Energy Agency. And excuse me if I stand in front here, but so I can point. This is actually saying where do we get our electricity generation from around the world. And this dark bit down here is coal, and the next bit is gas, and then up here the reds are hydro, solar and wind up there. So the way excuse me, the way we're going, it looks like coal is going to stay around the same. We're going to get a lot more solar and wind, and the hydros there still. But this is where we need to be as a world, with coal shrinking to zero by 2030, nearly. So there's many countries of the world, developing countries in particular, where it's going to be very difficult to make it zero by 2030. But the developed countries of the world should be absolutely zero there. Then with natural gas has got to be also going off the bottom there, and particularly in the developed world that's the case. And here we should be looking at solar, wind and hydro as taking the lion's share of the world energy generation. There's no excuse for not doing this, because those are now the cheapest forms of electricity generation. They're more suitable for the developing world because you can do it in a village. There's no reason to go down this fossil fuel path. I put one slide in here which I'm going to say just a minute or so about, because I gather that Laura Ferris is not going to be here. So this is the UK, and this was our Climate Change Act in 2008, said we were going to go from the emissions we had over here in 2006 down to 2050. It's going to be down to that level, a very low level. But then this was modified to saying we're going to go to zero by 2050. So that's what we've got to squeeze all these into here. These are various sectors of our activity. There's industry here, residential and commercial heat, domestic transport, electricity generation. Well, we've done quite well if you look at the total. However, it's almost all been done under the electricity generation, because we phased out coal. We've got the wind and increasingly solar as well, offshore wind. We have a resource like no one else in the world for wind. And so we are successful in that. But that really is the end of our success, because domestic transport, despite vehicles being more efficient and electric vehicles around, the emissions are almost flat. And residential and commercial heat, again, our housing stock, the way we generate the heat in our houses. So we're not doing very well on the other ones, and that's what we've got to do. And the Climate Change Committee that I was on has told the government in no uncertain terms, you've got the targets, but let's see the policies that will do it. So I've said that rather stronger than if Laura was here. Right, so we can avert climate change, there's no doubt. Unlike when I first talked about climate change in 1975, we didn't know how we'd tackle it. We now know that actually it's the thing of the future to do. We can do it. The question is, will we avert climate change? And I put a few things on the left. The left-hand side is the optimistic, and the right-hand side is the pessimistic. So climate change, unlike 1975, everyone could see it now. We all know it's there. And amazing developments in technology, we know how to do it, and it's the future. And those are the industries of the future. If you want to be in this game, you actually get in there and you get the new products that go along with that. So it's ideal for developing countries. Investment is there wanting to do it. And most countries have commitments there. And we've got this setup of peer pressure of countries. And there's a real opportunity to lead the world. We were leading the world, but we're faltering. Public concern is now there and the demand that this should be tackled. On the other side, we have populism. The rise of populism really is not help. I think that goes along with selfishness of people and countries. What we've got to have is actually thinking of the community, thinking larger. I was thinking Queen Elizabeth had that thing of thinking for the larger thing, not the self. And that's what we have got to have. The vested interests, there's no doubt the money is in the old things that have been successful. If you have an oil company, your stock market price is in what's in the ground. And if suddenly that's worth nothing, your stock market price has gone down. And there's been a lot of money flowing around to influence events both in politics and muddying the world in the media about really the realities of climate change and what we need to do. The focus on the short term, again, can we actually focus on the long term rather than dealing with the latest little problem? They're big problems, the local ones, but the biggest problem of all we have is this long term one, because that means are we going to continue to exist on this planet? GDP growth, we're besotted with it. It's actually what we should be doing is well-being, and can we increase the well-being of both our country and others in the world? So we don't need to get involved in all those. I actually put in the last slide, which for those of us over a certain age, this was actually an amazing picture. 1968, 24th December, Christmas Eve, and it was Earthrise taken from the moon. And this was sort of, it's just a turning point in our thinking about our planet. That's our fragile planet on which we are. That planet could keep going very well without us. In fact, it would do far better without us. So the question is, are we going to be part of the future of that planet? Thank you.